Everyone has heard of the Trail of Tears. But ask about the Long Walk, and you will usually get silence, even though it happened a generation later, in the full light of the modern age, to a people who are today the largest native nation in the United States. In 1864, the United States Army marched more than 8,000 Navajo men, women, and children across up to 450 miles of high desert at gunpoint, to a barren internment camp on the Pecos River. Hundreds died walking. A quarter of the nation died in the camp. The Navajo do not call it the Long Walk, they call the whole ordeal Wieldy, the place of suffering, and for a century many would not speak of it at all. But this story ends differently than every other removal in American history. Because the Navajo did something no other removed nation ever managed, they came home. This is the story of the Long Walk and of the Walk Back. The Navajo, who call themselves Dine, the people, had built one of the most successful societies in the Southwest. Their homeland, Dineta, stretched across what is now Arizona and New Mexico, anchored by 4 sacred mountains that define the boundaries of their world to this day. They were not one thing but many: farmers raising corn in the canyon bottoms, master weavers whose blankets were prized across the continent, and above all, herders. After the Spanish brought sheep, the Dine built their whole way of life around them, measuring wealth, feeding families, and weaving from the wool of flocks that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. At the heart of the homeland lay Canyon de Chelly, sheer red rock walls sheltering cornfields, hogans, and peach orchards, thousands of peach trees, tended for generations. Remember those orchards. What happened to them tells you everything about what came next. The trouble had deep roots, decades of raiding and counter-raiding between the Navajo, the New Mexican settlements, and other nations, a cycle in which the Navajo were as often victims as raiders, especially of slave raids. Thousands of Navajo women and children were held in New Mexican households as servants and slaves, a fact rarely mentioned in the old histories. When the United States took the Southwest from Mexico, it inherited this tangled war and handled it badly, treaties signed and broken, a Navajo headman shot down at a peace meeting, forts planted in Navajo pasture. By the early 1860s, with the Civil War raging east, the new commander in New Mexico, General James Carleton, decided on a final solution to the Navajo question. The Dine would be removed from their homeland entirely, marched to a reservation of his choosing on the empty plains of the Pecos River, and remade there into Christian farmers. The place was called Bosque Redondo. Carleton called it a paradise. It was a trap. To break the Navajo, Carleton turned to the most famous frontiersman in America, Kit Carson. Carson was no cartoon villain, he had native friends and family, and he initially tried to resign rather than take the assignment, but he took it, and what he executed was total war. Through 1863 and into 1864, Carson's troops and their Ute allies swept through Navajo country, rarely catching the people themselves but destroying everything that kept them alive: cornfields burned, waterholes fouled, hogans torched, sheep and horses killed or driven off by the thousand. In January 1864, his columns pushed through Canyon de Chelly itself, the sanctuary of sanctuaries. And there his men spent days methodically chopping down and burning the peach orchards, thousands of trees, generations old. It was warfare aimed not at warriors but at survival itself. Facing starvation in a hard winter, band after band of Dine began coming in to surrender. By spring, thousands were gathered at the forts, hungry and destitute. Then the marching began. There was no single long walk, there were dozens, column after column through 1864, along routes of 300 to 450 miles from the forts in Navajo country to Bosque Redondo. The people walked, the army rode. Rations were short, wagons far too few, the winter cold brutal and the pace unforgiving. The elderly and the sick fell behind, and Navajo oral history preserves what happened to those who could not keep up. They were shot where they lay, or simply left. Pregnant women who went into labor were, in the accounts passed down through families, given no time to stop. Rivers were forded in freezing water by people who could not swim. Raiders picked off stragglers for slaves along the way. No one counted the dead precisely, the army barely counted the living, but hundreds died on the marches, and every Navajo family today carries a story from those columns. That is why the nation still speaks of it in one breath: the Long Walk. What waited at the end was worse than the road. Bosque Redondo, the Navajo say Wieldy, was a 40-square-mile flat of alkaline plain on the Pecos, chosen by Carleton against the advice of his own officers. The water was bitter and sickening, the mesquite firewood was stripped within months, so people dug roots from the ground to burn, the soil was poor and the Pecos flooded or dried by turns. Onto this ground the army crowded more than 8,000 Navajo alongside several hundred Mescalero Apache, their sometime enemies, forced onto the same tract. The plan was that the Dine would farm. They dug miles of irrigation ditches, planted year after year, and year after year the crops died. Cutworms took the corn in 1865, drought and hail took the rest. The government-issued rations were scanty, often spoiled, and cut by corrupt contractors. People were reduced to boiling hides. Smallpox and other diseases swept the camp. In 4 years at Bosque Redondo, roughly a quarter of the Navajo people died. The Dine had been marched 400 miles to starve slowly on ground that could not feed them. Yet even in Wieldy, the Dine did not dissolve, and how they held together is its own testament. Families rebuilt their hogans in the old way, doorways facing east, even on the hated ground. The ceremonies continued quietly, the singers kept the chants and the stories alive, teaching them to children born in the camp who had never seen the sacred mountains they were learning to name. Leaders like Barboncito, Manolito, who had held out in the homeland longest, coming in only in 1866, starving but unbroken, and Ganado Mucho kept the bands organized and kept pressing the officers, year after year, with a single message: this experiment is killing us, let the people go home. Some Dine slipped away and made the desperate journey back on foot through hostile country, many others endured, waited, and watched. The nation bent under Wieldy. It refused to break. That refusal is what walked into the treaty tent in 1868. By 1868, even Washington could no longer pretend. Carleton's Paradise had become a national scandal, the experiment had cost millions, the crops had failed 4 years running, the people were dying, and reformers and journalists were asking hard questions. Carleton himself had been removed from command. That spring, the government sent 2 commissioners to decide the Navajo's fate. One of them was General William Tecumseh Sherman, the hardest of hard men, who had burned Georgia. The plan in many official minds was yet another removal: ship the Navajo east to Indian Territory, in Oklahoma, where the removed nations had been dumped for 40 years. Sherman arrived at Bosque Redondo expecting to arrange it. What changed history is what he found there, and who stood up to speak. The man who spoke was Barboncito, a headman and ceremonial singer from Canyon de Chelly, chosen by the Dine as their voice. Through an interpreter, over days of negotiation, he gave one of the great speeches in American history, recorded by the Commission's own clerks. He told Sherman plainly what the land meant, that the Dine had been created within the 4 sacred mountains, and that their God had warned them never to live east of the Rio Grande. Bringing us here, he said, has caused a great decrease of our numbers, many of us have died, also a great number of our animals. Our grandfathers had no idea of living in any other country. And then the sentence that still rings: I hope to God you will not ask me to go to any other country except my own. Sherman, the man who had told the South that war is hell and meant it, listened. And Sherman, of all people, relented. The Navajo, he agreed, could go home. On June 1, 1868, at Bosque Redondo, the leaders of the Dine, Barboncito first among them, put their marks on the Treaty of 1868, and it stands alone in the history of the removals, the only major treaty of its era that returned a removed nation to its own homeland. The terms were hard: the reservation was only a fraction of the old country, the people had to pledge peace forever, children were promised to schools, but the heart of it was everything: home. Weeks later, the columns formed again, and more than 8,000 Navajo began the long walk in reverse, this time walking toward the sacred mountains, not away from them. The accounts of that return march are among the most moving in the American record. When the people crested the last rises and saw Mount Taylor, Sudzil, the southern sacred mountain, rise blue on the horizon, men and women who had survived 4 years of Wieldy fell to their knees and wept. They had walked into exile as prisoners. They walked home as a nation that had refused to die. What the Dine built after 1868 is the ending no one saw coming. They came home to ruin burned fields, dead orchards, a fraction of their sheep, with little more than the treaty, some government livestock, and each other. And from that, they rebuilt everything. The flocks grew again into the hundreds of thousands, the weavers returned to their looms, and Navajo textiles became world famous. The reservation, through persistence and negotiation, was expanded again and again over the following decades until it became the largest in the United States, 27,000 square miles, bigger than 10 of the states. The population, cut by a quarter at Wieldy, grew and grew. Today the Navajo Nation numbers around 400,000 people, the largest native nation in the country, governing itself from Window Rock with its own laws, police, colleges, and language. The nation Carlton tried to erase became the biggest one there is. History rarely writes an answer that clean. And the story looped back on itself one more time, in the strangest way. The children the 1868 treaty promised to schools became, 3 generations later, the young men who carried the Navajo language into the United States Marine Corps, the code talkers of the Pacific War, whose unbreakable code this channel has already told. Think about that arc. A language the government tried to school out of Navajo children became the weapon that helped win America's greatest war, spoken by the great-grandchildren of the people who survived Wieldy. Today the Long Walk is finally being remembered. The Bosque Redondo Memorial stands at Fort Sumner, built at the urging of the Navajo and Mescalero themselves. June 1st is marked as Treaty Day, and every year, Dine runners retrace parts of the route running the road of suffering in the direction of home. The peach orchards of Canyon de Chelly have even been replanted. The trees are young. The roots are 300 years old. So remember the Long Walk, because it completes the picture this channel has drawn across so many episodes. It shows the machinery of removal at its most brutal, total war on food and orchards, a death march, a camp that killed a quarter of a nation. But it also shows the one thing that machinery could not manufacture, an ending where the people win. The Dine endured Wieldy, argued their way home with words at a treaty table, rebuilt from ashes, and grew into the largest native nation in America, still inside their 4 sacred mountains, still speaking the language, still weaving, still there. Barboncito asked God for nothing except his own country, and for once, history said yes. Next on this channel, our final episode of the season, the Native American harvest, the foods that conquered the entire world. Subscribe, and keep learning the history they left out.